Hi, folks, and welcome to Plane Time, a broadcast by the Florida Aviation Network. My colleague Ben Coleman, who normally hosts this program, has taken a well-deserved day off today. So substituting for him, I'm Ron Timmermans, one of the many other hosts with the Florida Aviation Network. And I'm delighted that you're able to join us today. We're broadcasting live and in the clear from our studio in Oviedo, Florida, and we're delighted to have you with us. Today's program includes some unique insights into aviation maintenance and also some interesting information for pilots like you and me relative to icing conditions and how they happen and how we can make sure that we don't succumb to the dangers of icing. My first guest today is who I want to introduce now. His name is Adrian Eichhorn, and he's from Manassas, Virginia. Adrian has an interesting background. He's a pilot, a mechanic, and a good friend. And so I'm delighted to have Adrian with us today. Adrian earned his pilot's license in the mid-1980s while he was still pursuing his career as an engineer officer with the U.S. Army. And he's been flying ever since, of course. After he retired from the U.S. Army, he went to work as a corporate pilot. And then after that, for a while, he flew for the Federal Aviation Administration and their corporate fleet out of Washington, D.C. He flew many of their airplanes to including their flagship, which is November 1. I asked him, November 1 what? And he said, no, it's just November 1. That's all it is. That's the only number. So that's pretty cool, being able to fly that airplane and the rest of the fleet for the FAA. Then Adrian went to work for a major airline, first as the FO, and then moving from the right seat to the left seat. And he became a captain for this major airline and worked there until he retired. And then today he's back in corporate aviation. But throughout his career in aviation as a pilot, he has also been a mechanic. And in the early 1990s, he bought a 1962 model P-35 Bonanza. And since then, he has been continually restoring it and making it better. Engine changes, engine overhauls, complete reskinning of the exterior of the airplane, interior repairs, avionics, and the like. Adrian has just tweaked this airplane unbelievably nice. And it was a good thing he did that, because in 2016, he decided to go off on a big adventure, and he flew that P-35 V-tail Bonanza around the world. Yes, sir. Joining that great club known as Earth Rounders. And not being satisfied yet with that much of an adventure, in 2021, he took off from Reykjavik, Iceland, and headed north until you couldn't go any further north. In other words, he made it to the North Pole, did a circle around the North Pole, and then headed south and ended up in Fairbanks, Alaska after a 20-plus hour nonstop flight in his Bonanza. Now, that's someone who has great confidence in his work as a mechanic and the airplane that he was flying solo over the North Pole. And then in last year, in 2022, he entered his P-35 Bonanza in a competition at Oshkosh, and his airplane was judged the grand champion in the contemporary custom category, meaning the best of the best. And so Adrian Eichhorn, professional pilot, adventurer, extraordinary mechanic, and good friend, thanks for joining us today. It's a delight to have you here.
Well, thank you, Ron. And I would just like to thank all of the people that support the Florida Aviation Network and organizations to make this possible, so that we can share seminars like this and the next one that will be presented today with pilots and people that are interested in aviation that aren't able to attend this. So thank you, Ron. Thank you for all of your efforts.
Good. Well, it's good to have you here, Adrian. And so, although we could probably talk for the entire time about your adventures in aviation, the things that you've done and the like, we really want to get into the mechanical aspects, which some insights that you've developed over the years that's worthy of sharing with our audience today, and I'm sure a lot of folks are watching that are looking forward to that. So Adrian, I'm familiar with the parts of the FAR is called 61 for certification, of course, of pilots, and then there's that Part 91 operating rules, and of course I always comply with those, and I'm sure you do as well. But Adrian, is there a part of the FARs that deal with maintenance?
There sure is, Ron, and when you think about the fact that he asked that question, because Ron has been in aviation for a long time, it's interesting that you look, when people get into aviation, rarely are they ever taught anything about maintenance or aircraft ownership. But there is, in 3 references, a great place to start is Part 43. Most of us carry the FAR AIM with us in our flight bags or in our aircraft. Part 3 is generally not included in the FAR AIM, but it is in the FAR AMT, and obviously it is available online. So part 43 is a great place for somebody that's interested in becoming more involved in maintenance, what they can and can't do. And interestingly enough, it's only 13 pages. And in those 13 pages are two appendices in the back. Appendix A, which covers what constitutes a major alteration, a minor alteration, a major repair, a minor repair, and what an owner can do as long as he has a pilot's license under preventative maintenance. It's maintenance that he can do that's not under the supervision of a mechanic. And also, if you ever wonder what is the bare minimum that's required on an annual or 100-hour inspection, it's listed in Appendix D. So it's a great reference. There's lots of other ACs, and I'll mention two other references here momentarily. So let's just take a real quick look at what an owner, some of the things that an owner is allowed to do under preventive maintenance. Obviously, they're listed here, and this list is what's published right now by the FAA and the FARs, but I will give a shout out to Mike Bush because the interpretation of what you can and can't do has really been subject to a lot of discussion yet. And I think we're allowed to do like tasks and other tasks that aren't listed this now based on some rulings that have come out in the last couple of years. So if you're really interested, take a look at Mike Bush's YouTube channel and get more involved with this. But this is the basics. And for example, you can replace a tire. You can change a tire on an aircraft. And interestingly enough, when I first did this years ago, I happened to be out at the airport, and one of the maintenance inspectors came by and he was asking questions. And he said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Well, I'm changing the tire under preventive maintenance." And he says, "Well, you just took the brake assembly off. You're not authorized to take the brake assembly off. That's not listed under preventive maintenance." So there is, in my opinion, a variance of what's acceptable amongst FAA inspectors nationwide. Imagine that. But it's an associated task, so I don't think there's a problem with that. But I think what's really important is if you're thinking about getting involved in preventive maintenance, keep your mechanic involved. Tell him what you're interested in doing. Get his guidance. You may need some special tools or some special guidance. And keep him in the loop, and he can supervise you have problems, because not all of the things that are as simple as they may appear, and we have a couple examples of that. So here's just a few samples of what's under airframe. Here's a few more, and the one that I'll bring note to is it specifically says replacing bulbs. That means you can replace a landing light or position light, a nav light. But it doesn't say anything about an interior cabin light or a post light, so you're not allowed to do that. But that, because it's a like test now, some people believe that you can do that. So looking on from that, there's one more reference, and that's AC 4313-12A. And that gives you more guidance about what you can do under preventive maintenance. And what's important is when you do work to an aircraft, you have to document it. I've had many discussions with owners over the years that say, "Yeah, I just replaced the spark plugs. Do I need to document?" Or, "I changed my oil. Do I need to document?" Yes, you are required by law, by regulation, to do that. And it's not difficult. You just write the task. Change oil, replenished with Aeroshell or whatever, changed filter. And then you're required to date it and sign it and put your pilot certificate next to it. And what's great about this AC is that the FAA went back a while back and determined, and they answered questions which are often misunderstood about preventive maintenance. So that's in there. And just for an example, when I first changed a tire on an aircraft, for those of you that don't have a bead breaker and access to one, I swear the cement gods and the tire gods bond the rim to the tire together, and it can be often difficult. And one of the guys on the field showed me, says, "Well, use a drill press." And obviously you don't want to have a drill in the drill press here, but you can leave the wheel halves bolted together and just use the leverage of the drill press to break the bead from the tire, and it works like a charm. And here's a picture of an aircraft tire, and I'll make note here because this is often overlooked. As you'll notice on the tire, there's a red dot. That's the lightest part of the tire when it's manufactured. That's the lightest part of the tire. And on the tube, the heaviest part of the tube is generally the stem. So you want to locate them together to help balance the tire.
And you can see that on the 9 o'clock position on this tire, the red dot and the valve stem of the tube. So those are supposed to be lined up, not opposite each other.
Right, and often I see them 180 degrees opposite, which makes the case work. So you want to help balance the tire, because unfortunately we don't balance aircraft tires like we do automobile tires, because they spin at a much lower RPM and they're much smaller.
Yeah. Adrian, if I could interrupt you for a moment. So I just want to make sure I get a better understanding of this Part 43 of the FARs that governs what we can do for maintenance, particularly owner preventive maintenance. So there's some unique things in there that says you can specifically do as an owner, like oil changes, tire changes, and the like. But then by absence of some things, it would be assumed that you can't do those as an owner. You need to have a mechanic do that and sign it off for you and the like. But now recently you said there's some, the FAA is getting a little bit more relaxed about that. So there's like items, because before, when you got caught at the airport.
And counseled.
And counseled, right? You took the tire off, which you can do legally under Part 43, but you had to remove the brake assembly, which you couldn't do under Part 43, so you were really kind of in the gray area there, huh?
Well, that was the interpretation of the new maintenance inspector at the time, but because it's an associated task, you are allowed to do that. So yeah. I think the bottom line is there's a lot of gray area, and there's a lot of differing opinions right now industry-wide on what you can and can't do. But I think this is a base document. If you follow this document, you can't get in trouble. But I think now the interpretation is we're allowed to do a lot more than what is specifically stated in Appendix A.
But even so, it's probably a good idea for me as an owner to have an association with a mechanic, a local mechanic, so that I have his or her guidance on what I'm about to do and whether or not I really should do that, whether I'm legally allowed to do that, whether or not the mechanic needs to do a sign-off on it separately and the like. And then also so I don't get into trouble, because I could easily get into things that I don't know a whole lot about, and then I'd be really wrapped up and not have a mechanic. So it's a good idea to have a relationship with a mechanic.
Yeah, absolutely, Ron. And that's for respect for the mechanic, because the mechanic is the guy that determines each year whether your airplane is airworthy or not. And it's good for him to know what has been done on it in the previous year. And as well, if there's an illustrated parts catalog or a maintenance manual that's available that you can read before performing the task, it's good to keep everybody involved, because I think in summary all the tasks are not quite as simple as they may appear. Yeah. And obviously you don't want to do something wrong which could lead to some type of a disaster.
Yeah, yeah. So I've heard that, well, a lot of people talk about your airplane has to be in an airworthy condition, and that there's this thing called conformity inspection. Just tell us, if you would, what does an airworthy condition connote with my airplane?
Okay, Ron, before I get to that, there's one last reference I'd like to cover. And this is 431312B. This is an excellent reference for not only home builders, but anybody that works or repairs an airplane, because these are acceptable practices. If you're going to put a patch on an aluminum aircraft, you can determine your rivet spacing. If you're going to add some type of electrical device, based on the amperage and the length of the wire, it'll tell you what gauge to use. So this is a great reference to have, not only for you to learn, but to if you want to follow up on what the shop did to make to the shop, or the person that worked on the aircraft, that they did it in accordance with what is acceptable to the FAA. So your next question, and that's a very, very good question, and Part 1 of the Federal Aviation Regulations is definitions and abbreviations, and interestingly enough, the definition of airworthiness is not in there. I challenge any one of you when you go home tonight to try and find it. It's very difficult, but interestingly enough, it's on the back of our airworthiness certificate, and the definition of airworthiness is a very, very vague definition. It has two parts. The first part is that it must conform to the type design. And that probably doesn't mean much to you right now, but in a few minutes it should start all to come together. And then the second part And I think if you asked 10 mechanics or 10 pilots, you'd probably get 10 different opinions in a condition for safe flight. Now, if you can't drive a truck through this regulation, I don't know. It's about as vague as it can get, except for the first part. So real quickly, what the first part means is when our aircraft are produced by a manufacturer, they're produced under a type certificate data sheet. It's kind of like a birth certificate for a person. And that type certificate data sheet is produced by the FAA, and it's to ensure that the first aircraft in that production and the last one are all produced to the same standard, and the manufacturer can't some way through the production say, well, I want to put this engine instead of this engine, it's more approved, without modifying the type certificate data sheet. You probably can't read this type certificate data sheet, but the type certificate data sheet will include the engine that belongs in that airplane, the propeller, the limits, how much fuel, the length, the weight, all of the operating limitations on the airspeed indicator, the oil temperature. There's a ton of information on that, and that's the baseline for that aircraft. So why is it important to do a conformity inspection? A conformity inspection is something that the very first thing that a maintenance shop should do before they do an annual inspection. I think it's often overlooked. It's a great place for an owner to get more involved with what his airplane is and what's in his airplane. So if you just bought a new G36 Bonanza and it had no major alterations or major repairs, there'd be no need to do a conformity inspection because it was just produced under type certificate data sheet. By contrast, I have a 1962 Bonanza that over the course of the last 60 years has been highly modified. So every time there's a modification done to an aircraft, unlike in the RV or the boat world, which doesn't really need to be documented or approved by the Department of Transportation, the FAA says if you're going to alter from the type certificate data sheet, it needs to be done by approved data. And we've all heard the term STC, or field approval. And STC, if a company comes out with, say you want to put tip tanks on a Bonanza, they'll be produced in accordance with approved via an STC, and that's the data which allows you to install that tip tank on a particular aircraft. And that major alterations, in the same way for major repairs, they are documented on a form called a 337, FAA Form 337. When that is finished, and a 337 basically has the mechanic, or the person doing the install signs the top part, the bottom part is inspected by an IA returning the airplane to service. The second page of it describes what is done. And if you take your aircraft in to, say, have an engine change or a different propeller put on it, and it has to be done under that STC, you should have a copy in your logbooks, but most importantly, that 337 needs to end up in Oklahoma City. And years ago, it was a requirement for mechanics, and this was taken away with an FAA Paper Reduction Act, where a mechanic had 48 hours to produce the 337 to the local FSDO. The FSDO would look at it, make sure that it was done in its accordance with the STC, and it was their responsibility to send it to Oklahoma City. That's all changed. Now the mechanic does it, and it's his responsible. So the conformity inspection, the first thing you can do under the Freedom of Information Act is you can go online, and on this slide, you can see the website. You can go on faa.gov/registration. You can write them or you can call them. You give them the serial number and the N number for an aircraft, and they will send you what the FAA has on file. So that's the baseline. And that's the most important thing. Everything that was done to your airplane has to be at Oklahoma City. If there's an unfortunate event and there's a fatality involved, the NTSB will pull what's called a blue ribbon packet on the pilot, which will give all his qualifications and ratings. And then they'll get a hold of what Oklahoma City has on for the aircraft. So you need to make sure that the 337, what is in your equipment, based on the equipment list and everything that's in there to the best of your knowledge, and it's often required to get a mechanic or somebody that's involved in a type club with a particular airplane. The equipment that's on your airplane, does it have tip tanks? Does it have vortex generators? Does it have a speed slope window, a 3-blade prop instead of a 2-blade prop, auxiliary landing lights, a new autopilot, a new nav unit? Is all that listed on your equipment list? Do you have a copy of the 337, and does Oklahoma City have a copy? And if it's not at Oklahoma City, you need to make sure that it gets there.
So the paper trail has got awful important to us if
It
we're
is.
going to remain legal, isn't it?
It is.
So let me make sure I understand this from a simple pilot's perspective. So let's say my wife bought me a brand new G36 Bonanza for my birthday. Wouldn't that be nice? Hint, hint. But it would have a birth certificate.
You were smart to have married her.
Indeed. Thank you. It would have a birth certificate, the type certificate that you showed a picture of. And it would show all of the things about that airplane when it came off the assembly line.
Correct.
And all the ones subsequent to that would be manufactured in accordance with that birth certificate, that type certificate. Okay. Then if I wore out the engine, had to put in a new engine, if I put the same engine in, I wouldn't have to do a supplemental type certificate, right, an STC,
Correct.
because it's the same engine, still complies with the original birth certificate.
Correct.
But if I put tip tanks on it, it didn't come out from the factory with tip tanks. Now I have to have tip tanks that are manufactured to specific requirements, and that manufacturer of the tip tanks goes to the FAA and says, I'd like these to be approved on this model Bonanza and so on and so forth. They get an STC, a supplemental type certificate, supplementing that original birth certificate.
Correct.
Now we're legal to put those on, but as the mechanic putting them on, you have to fill out an FAA Form 337 that documents what you did and completes the paper trail, and then that has to be sent into the FAA so that they document it in your record in their FAA databases. Wow.
Exactly.
Same way with an autopilot. This
Exactly.
this old airplane that you bought didn't have an autopilot probably when you got it. Now you put one in, but that's a change from the original birth certificate, so you have to have an STC showing that autopilot is approved for your particular model airplane, and it has an STC to prove that. Then you do a 337 form and send it into the FAA, and now you're legal. The paper trail.
Right.
Okay, so it's
and
rather
on that
complex.
337, when a shop, say, installs a new autopilot, if he takes the old autopilot out, that's all documented under the description of work. So one alibi I forgot to mention is when you say you put a new autopilot in an airplane or a new EDM 830 engine monitor or a new GPS, those units generally come with a flight manual supplement. In other words, the manufacturer that's making that autopilot is telling the pilot how to operate it. That flight manual supplement is required to be carried in the aircraft.
So as is the POH, so it might be a supplement.
Correct. And most POHs are small, most flight manual supplements are 11 by 8 sheets of paper, and the STC, the maintenance log books, and none of that should be carried in the airplane ever. But the flight manual supplements, if you were to get a ground check by an FAA guy, he would look for the flight manual supplements, and if you didn't have them, that would not be good.
Back to the conformity inspection that you mentioned, Adrian. So this is kind of a check that you do as a mechanic. Here's the original birth certificate, the type certificate. Here's all the stuff that's in the airplane. Does the paper trail support what's in the airplane? And if it doesn't, then what? Are we not legal to fly?
That's correct, because the airplane is unairworthy. And sometimes it's very difficult, like S-Tech autopilots, for example. Only S-Tech certified or repair stations are allowed to install them. So I couldn't just say autopilot installed in accordance with it. It becomes pretty complicated at that point, and it can be pretty expensive. And this leads into the importance of a pre-buy inspection.
When you're purchasing an airplane?
If you're purchasing an airplane and the airplane looks good, you just did a walk around or a mechanic did a brief inspection without doing a really good conformity inspection, you might just have bought a basket of problems.
Yeah.
So conformity inspection is really important. And if I look back over the years of all the airplanes that I have maintained, I can honestly say that the airplanes are generally in better condition than the logbooks are. And again, it's justifiable because owners and pilots are not taught anything on how to be an aircraft owner or about maintenance.
And that's one of the reasons we invited Adrian here today, so that we can explain to you things that are important to you and me as pilots that we may not have otherwise understood. Adrian has a great extensive background in working and maintaining airplanes, most of them Beechcraft, but you've worked in other airplanes as well. But the things that he's sharing with us today are applicable to all airplanes and the like. And I think it's interesting that you just mentioned the pre-purchase inspection. So most of us getting ready to invest a large amount of money in an aircraft that we want to buy will have a mechanic do a pre-purchase inspection. Now, when I think of a pre-purchase inspection, I don't think so much about the paperwork. I think is the flap on solid? Is the compressions on the engine in good shape? Does the gear swing up and down like it's supposed to and hit the limits and the like? And is all the fuselage intact and no corrosion or anything like that? But equally important is this conformity inspection that you mentioned, so that the airplane that I purchase. The airplane that I purchased has everything in it, and all the paperwork lines up with it like it's supposed to. This is an important part of aircraft ownership that probably many of us don't really understand or have an appreciation for, but it is important.
Very overlooked, Ron, very much so.
Yeah. So you've had some other examples of aircraft that you've worked on. I remember one you said the conformity inspection just showed some vast deficiencies and the like. Can you address that just a bit more before we take a break?
Yeah, real quickly. I met an individual at one of our clinics who had purchased a Beechcraft Bonanza from a guy out in Southern California. He had a Beechcraft certified repair station do a pre-buy, and that led to an annual inspection. A year later, I do the annual, and we found, I forget how many, but many missing 337s that never made it to Oklahoma City or his logbooks. So we got Beechcraft involved. Beechcraft ferried the airplane down to a maintenance facility near Fulton County, or near Atlanta, Georgia, took care of all of this because it was their repair station that had messed this up. But for the whole year, if something would have happened, he was flying an unairworthy airplane because the conformity inspection was never completed.
Yeah, wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, I was shocked.
Yeah. So what possibly could have happened to that pilot had he been ramp checked by the FAA? They would have...
Flying an unairworthy airplane, that could lead to a violation.
Uh-huh.
And that's going to come out later, but the nice thing about this, the FAA got this right. The FAA holds the owner, the pilot, responsible for maintenance. It's not the mechanic. So those of us that own airplanes that just think, well, the mechanic's responsible for all the maintenance on it, that is 100% incorrect. It's a shared liability, but the owner is responsible for maintenance. So
maybe my airplane, and I got a mechanic that's working on it, but who shares in the responsibility, but the ultimate responsibility is mine to make sure I'm flying an airworthy airplane.
Yes, sir.
And one that is in conformance. Yeah. Well, this is great information. You know, you've clarified a lot of things for me, and probably for some of our audience watching us as well, making sure we understand what airworthy means and what a conformity inspection is and why it's so danged important. So we're going to take a short break in just a moment here, and we're going to have Adrian back, and the next topics are going to be having to do with an annual inspection. So this is something that you and I do every year with our airplanes, and we're going to learn how it's best to begin a rapport with our mechanic, know what to ask, know what responsibilities to push on the mechanic, and what responsibilities remain ours as the owner of the airplane. So stay tuned. We'll be back in just a few minutes after a short break, and we're going to learn a whole lot more about annual inspections. I'm Ron Timmermans with Florida Aviation Network. Stay tuned. Be back in 15 minutes. Don't go away.